Chapter 8. Ahmad and Qasim were tried by a ZOBBO court of 7 men. Ahmad was accused of being a planted spy for the government, and the punishment upon conviction was death. The charge against Qasim was adultery. He was unmarried, but his alleged fornication with Aisha was deemed to be an adulterous act, which carried a sentence of 100 lashes. Ahmad denied the charge. ZOBBO investigators compelled testimony from Aisha, who stated that Ahmad was her brother. The prosecutor majorly relied on this statement to make his case of information concealment and infiltration against Ahmad. If his claimed good intention to join ZOBBO was genuine, he had to have known about his sister's captivity, especially as it had been widely reported in the news on the government side before he joined up. Pretending to his recruiter to be unaware of Aisha's presence in the camp was tantamount to hiding information, which strongly suggested a nefarious plot to sabotage ZOBBO in some fashion. Aisha had claimed in her defense in the adultery charge that Qasim had merely provided her with security along the way to her brother's hut, but she had been unaware of Qasim's testimony, which contradicted her claim. Ahmad did not testify in his defense, for he did not want to contradict Aisha. He thought Aisha's statement had been made without any malice, and that she either made it because it would somehow help him in his defense, or she had been coerced into making it. Qasim denied the charge of adultery, but his guardmates testified against him. ZOBBO's prosecutor was loose with the facts, and his interrogatory techniques had been brutal. Qasim was beaten up and forced to sign a confession statement admitting to the crime. The 7-judge panel took about an hour to reach verdicts in the trials. It convicted Ahmad of concealment and spying and sentenced him to death by hanging or firing squad. Qasim was convicted and sentenced to 100 lashes of the whip. He maintained his innocence as he was led out of the courtroom. "I didn't do it," he said. "The woman can corroborate my claim. We didn't do anything like that." Aisha's trial on the charge of adultery was the first such trial of a woman in the ZOBBO camp. The gallery was therefore full of people who had come to watch the trial. There were extremists in the crowd who had come to mock and shame Aisha. She was terrified as she listened to the false testimony of her ZOBBO accusers. She denied the charge, but she had no chance of acquittal in view of the tactics of the ZOBBO prosecutor. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by stoning. The extremists in the audience erupted in joy at the verdict, and they rained abuses and curses on Aisha, who wept as she was led away by ZOBBO fighters. Qasim's punishment was carried out quickly within 24 hours of his conviction. He was tied up to a tree and lashed 100 times with a whip. He writhed in pain and agony as the whip cracked his bare back over and over again until he passed out. Aisha and Ahmad were taken to their respective cells to await execution. Ahmad was to be shot by a firing squad. Aisha's death by stoning would involve a longer process. First, a pit had to be dug to a depth that would expose her upper body to stone strikes from the crowd that would be assembled for the macabre and barbaric execution. Then the sharp and heavy stones that could do the most damage had to be collected. Inside her cell, Aisha constantly prayed for a miracle. Aisha had learned from her dad that miracles were possible, regardless of how bleak a situation might be. Her father had survived prostate cancer, and he believed prayers, more than surgery and medication, had healed him. Upon the diagnosis of the disease, he had sought medical care from a local witch doctor, who treated him with concoctions and exoteric incantations. But he did not get better. When he was persuaded by Aisha's mother to seek Western medical intervention, the cancer had worsened, and his chances of survival were very poor. But the cancer had later gone into remission, and he believed his strong faith and prayers had made it happen. This was the kind of faith that Aisha would lean on now. Ahmad was on her mind in her prayers as well, for if a miracle were to occur, she would be unfulfilled if Ahmad was not positively impacted by it as well. Ahmad, who had long accepted his fate, simply waited for the day his short sojourn on God's beautiful earth would all come to an end. He spent his time reminiscing about his life, his triumphs, and challenges. Maybe he should have taken up his father's offer and accepted his arranged marriage deal a few years before he had met Aisha. The situation he was now in would have been totally avoided, he thought. But this line of thinking upset him because it connoted regret for his actions, and he didn't feel any. He had made his choice, bold and perhaps reckless in the judgment of many, but he would do it again for the love of his life if he had to. Should ZOBBO kill him, as appears certain that it would do, and should Aisha suffer the same fate as he suspected would happen, they would reunite in the afterlife, in the celestial realm. As in Aisha's thoughts, a possible miraculous change in his dire situation fleetingly interrupted his thoughts, but it was immediately suppressed by the military mindset which suffused his being now to make him fearless of death. Yes, it would be fantastic if a miracle was to occur, but dwelling on it was weak for a soldier. He did feel embittered to be going out in a firing squad as the latest statistic of sheriff's brutal crusade to topple the state. An honorable way for a soldier to die, he strongly felt, was as a battlefield casualty. But this was now an aspiration as impossible to occur as the government caving into ZOBBO demands and declaring a national Islamic theocracy. The trial records were sent to Sheriff for his review and approval, and it took him a couple of weeks to provide the feedback because he attended to several other matters of ZOBBO that required an enormous amount of his time. When his feedback was received and read, it had affirmed the verdicts. The firing field, where many men had met their deaths, was prepared for Ahmad's execution. Some had been killed there for murder, others for suspicions of disloyalty, but a majority came from the constantly changing top leadership of ZOBBO, and they were shot after losing out to Sheriff in bitter struggles over dogma, strategy, and religious purity. Aisha's execution pit was dug, and the stones for the killing were packed in a heap several yards away from the pit. It was the night before the executions, and Aisha was in deep prayer for a miracle. But should that elude her, she prayed for her acceptance to paradise as an alternative after her death. She prayed for several hours until she fell asleep. Just before dawn, at about 3:30 a.m., she was awakened by powerful rumblings of thunder and a heavy downpour. This went on for several minutes. Then the violent sounds from the sky were suddenly exacerbated by explosions from bombs dropped from fighter bombers streaking through the skies on a bombing run. The ZOBBO camp was now under a combined assault by the violent weather and a strafing by the Air Force. Aisha looked out the small window of her cell, and she observed that several structures in the camp had been hit and were on fire. She also observed hundreds of fighters running out of the camp. She tried to open the door to her cell, but it had been padlocked by her guards, who had joined in the great escape from the camp as the warplanes made pass after pass, dropping bombs. Her cell miraculously escaped the massive destruction of the camp. Ahmad came to her mind, and she prayed for his safety. Like Aisha, Ahmad was asleep when the coincidence of natural and man-made violence was unleashed on the camp. But unlike Aisha, whose sleep was induced by exhaustion from several hours of praying, Ahmad's sleep was primarily caused by boredom. As the twin events occurred loudly, Ahmad had also observed the fighters running to escape from the bombs. He saw the guards, who had been guarding his cell, take off as well into the darkness. He thought to himself that his chance to escape was now or never. He kicked down the door, and he had to go at it from several feet away several times to kick it with his right foot until it was dislodged from its packed mud hold in the wall. He looked outside and confirmed that the guards were gone. His freedom had come at last. Aisha had to be freed too, but he did not have the foggiest idea of where to find her in the expansive camp, which was now largely deserted. The storm still lashed the camp with a fury, and the jet bombers continued making passes after knocking out the camp's anti-aircraft guns. Ahmad could take off running into the darkness like everyone else and wouldn't be recognizable. But he was torn between doing that or to go looking for Aisha. He chose the latter, with all the risks it entailed, such as risk of exposure to ZOBBO fighters if the early morning darkness, which provided him cover, were to give way to daylight and made him easily recognizable to ZOBBO fighters, most of whom had run into the bushes outside the camp. Ahmad was certain of Aisha's detention, but he was not sure whether she was still alive. He still decided to make an effort to locate her before daylight, and if unsuccessful, he would leave with sadness in his heart. If she was still in detention, he figured it had to be within the same area of his own confinement, and he decided to walk through a mix of small buildings and huts within a 40-yard radius of his cell. The buildings were all emptied out with doors ajar, except for a small hut with a padlock on the door. Might it be Aisha's cell? He wondered. He knocked on the wooden door, but there was no answer. He backed up and raced towards the door and kicked it with his right foot. The thunderous kick dislodged the door, and it came crashing down on the floor. He looked inside, but the hut was empty. There was nobody inside. Ahmad was disappointed, and at that point, he decided to leave the camp immediately. He took off running, hoping to cover at least a couple of miles before daybreak. He ran past the now abandoned guardhouse by the main gate, took a right turn into the bushes, and disappeared in it. It was about 5 a.m. now, and the darkness still enveloped the horizon. Ahmad had covered 2 miles when a most amazing sight came into view. As he ran, now a trot more than a run, the back of a lady, about a couple of 100 meters away, in a section of the bush with a clear sight through low vegetation, acquired better form and recognition. She was tall and walked like his beloved Aisha. He was now 20 yards, 10 yards, a couple of yards away from her. It became unmistakable to him from a few feet away that the lady was indeed Aisha. He stopped to catch his breath from the shock, then called her name. Aisha! The lady turned around to look, and her face displayed astonishment. Ahmad, she shrieked. They hugged, but only briefly because they were in a hurry to get to safety. Aisha carried an AK-47 rifle. Ahmad was curious about how she got it, but there was no point in asking questions about it now and risk a distraction from the life and death matter they faced and the compelling need to keep moving as fast as they could from the ZOBBO enemy to avoid a recapture. Aisha handed over the AK-47 to Ahmad, who slung it on his left shoulder. They kept up a trail in the bushes, literally smelling wildlife and hearing the sounds of scurrying animals on dried leaves on the forest floor. They had covered 3 miles when they decided to take a rest. They were now out of ZOBBO's reach, and even if ZOBBO were to send fighters after them, Ahmad felt confident that he could hold them at bay with the AK-47. Ahmad had several questions to ask Aisha. How was she able to leave the camp? How did she lay her hands on the AK-47? And what was her situation like before the explosive events that sprung them out of the clutches of ZOBBO? When the bombs had hit the camp, knocking out the anti-aircraft guns and killing the operators, panic had set in, and it caused the camp's residents to flee. Qasim, who was back on duty after serving his sentence, went to Aisha's cell and set her free. He knew Aisha was innocent. Since their wrongful conviction, he had been worried about her. Aisha's impending execution, for which several residents of the camp were being mobilized to be the stone throwers that would kill her, bothered him a great deal. In spite of his conviction and lashing, he thought about ways he could free her, even if he lost his life in the process. And the air raid and the chaos of its aftermath turned out to be serendipitous. Qasim not only freed her, but he also gave her the AK-47 for her protection along the routes of her escape. He couldn't come with her because he was a committed member of ZOBBO who believed in its ultimate goal of establishing a theocracy. He just felt that the wrong committed against Aisha had to be righted, and he was glad to do it. Aisha knew how to use assault rifles because she had been trained in their use by Omar. Sheriff had decreed mandatory training for every resident of the camp as part of the collective armed defense of the camp should it come under ground attack, as had occurred before from government forces. When Ahmad had showed up at the empty hut, Aisha had already been set free from the actual hut she was detained in, several yards away from where Ahmad had gone. She was out of the camp by 4:30 a.m. and had a head start of 30 minutes over Ahmad along the escape route. End of chapter 8.